The screen is dark. The silence is heavy. Then, faint typing sounds begin. Words flicker across the unseen glow of a computer screen. They are not important on their own. Items for sale, rooms for rent, rides offered to strangers. But they all carry the same weight. An invitation to trust someone you have never met. A quiet voice enters. Not loud, not emotional, but cold and steady. They say that the internet erased distance. It did not erase danger. It only invited it into your home. The scene shifts to a lonely house at night. The porch light buzzes faintly. A car pulls into the driveway. Its headlights sweep across the windows like searchlights across an empty stage. Inside the vehicle, someone exhales slowly, gripping the steering wheel tighter than they expected. They came here to buy something simple, something ordinary, but already something feels wrong. The voice continues. Every story begins the same way. An email, a phone call, a promise. And then the drive, alone, down a road where the houses grow farther apart, where the night grows heavier, and where questions begin to whisper in the mind. Who is waiting at the other end? What do they want? And why do they hide their face until the last possible moment? The sound of a door opening echoes in the darkness. Footsteps across gravel. A hesitant knock on the door. The pause after that knock feels endless. The porch light trembles in the cool wind. Then the door creaks open, only a sliver, and no one speaks. It is in these moments, the hesitation, the silence, that fear plants its seed. Not in the violence itself, but in the possibility. The mind fills the gaps. Perhaps the person inside is only shy. Perhaps they are cautious. But perhaps they are watching, standing just out of sight, waiting for the visitor to step forward, waiting for them to cross the threshold. The narration turns colder. Craigslist was meant to be a marketplace, a place where strangers could help strangers. But the truth is that behind every listing there may be another intention, hidden and patient. And when the door opens, it is not always an exchange of goods that takes place. Sometimes it is an exchange of lives. Sometimes it is the last knock you will ever make. The scene grows darker, the house more shadowed. A hand slowly reaches for the doorframe. The porch light flickers out. For a moment the screen is empty black, only the sound of breathing audible. The narrator whispers again, but the whisper cuts deeper this time. You arrive for a chair, for a sofa, for a lamp. But what is waiting for you is not furniture. It is something that cannot be returned. It is something that cannot be explained away. And once you are inside, the world outside no longer belongs to you. The imagery grows sharper. An empty living room, boxes stacked in corners. A hallway that stretches too far, with shadows swallowing the far end. A mirror that reflects only part of the room, as if hiding what stands beyond it. The air feels heavy. Even though nothing has happened yet, it already feels too late. Fear is not loud. It does not arrive screaming. It arrives in small details. The faint smell of something burnt in the air. A locked door at the end of a hallway. The way the host never quite meets your eyes. The way they smile only with their mouth and never with their face. The narrator's tone does not rise, but it sharpens. These are not accidents. They are not coincidences. They are choices. And the moment you stepped into that house, you gave someone else the choice of what happens next. You thought you came to buy. You thought you came to sell. But what you really came for was to learn the answer to a question you should never have asked. The screen flashes images like fragments of memory. A newspaper clipping about a missing person. A photograph of a couch listed for sale. A shaky cell phone message that says only, "I am here, where are you?" And then silence, the sound of static creeps in. The screen blurs. Then the voice whispers again, slow and cold. Do you know how many people never came back from meetings like these? Do you know how many doors opened to silence and closed with no witness to see? You will never know the number. You will never know their names. You will only know that you could be next. The camera lingers on the front door of the house again, closed now, still. The porch light flickers on, steady this time, as if nothing had ever happened. The driveway is empty. The house is quiet. Yet the unease remains, the same question repeating. Who was inside? And what did they want? The voice fades out, leaving only the sound of wind pressing against the windows. The story has not begun. Yet already the seed of dread has been planted. The question is not whether horror will come, but how quickly it will arrive. And when it does, who will be left to tell the story? The story did not begin with screams or with blood. It began with something quieter, almost ordinary. A listing online. A few lines of text typed in a rush, offering something small, something cheap, something that seemed harmless. A desk, a sofa, a free box of books. a ride to a nearby city. These were not things meant to raise alarms. They were fragments of daily life, little exchanges that formed the rhythm of modern survival. The world had already shifted by the time these encounters began. The early internet had promised connection, but connection came at a price. No one asked to see identification. No one asked for proof. Trust was built not on who someone was, but on what they typed. And once the email was sent, once the message was answered, the bridge between stranger and victim was built. Invisible, fragile, and waiting to break. The location was never glamorous. It was always somewhere ordinary. A backdrop that carried no warning. Suburban neighborhoods with trimmed hedges and mailboxes leaning slightly forward as if in anticipation. Empty apartments with faded carpet and blinds pulled too tight. Rural roads where the houses disappeared one by one until the silence felt heavy enough to press against the chest. These were not places people expected to die. They were places where people went to live, where they worked, where they raised families. That was the camouflage. That was the trap. Those who stepped into these encounters were not reckless. They were ordinary people, guided by the same logic anyone might use. Why pay full price at a store when something cheaper waits online? Why not meet a stranger if the deal is good enough? Why not take a risk when the world around you whispers that everyone else is doing the same? But the darkness beneath that logic was patient. The community around these events often remembered things only in fragments. Neighbors recalled seeing cars that did not belong in the driveway. They remembered lights flickering in houses where no one lived. They remembered faces at the door that they could not quite describe later. And they remembered the silence afterward, the way the lawn grew uncut, the way the mailbox filled with unopened envelopes, the way the world seemed to forget someone had ever been there. Time itself became part of the tension. The late 2000s and early 2010s were years when Craigslist had become both lifeline and risk. Millions used it without trouble, trading couches, bicycles, even companionship. But in the cracks of those transactions, predators found cover. The anonymity was a mask that no one could tear away. Behind a screen, behind a username, anyone could become what they needed to be. The ordinary was the most dangerous disguise. A man needing to sell tools, a woman renting a spare room, a student offering carpool rides. There was no clear boundary between safety and risk. The boundary existed only in hindsight, when the story was already written, when the police tape was already tied across the porch. The emotional stakes of these stories were not measured only in blood, but in betrayal. Each victim believed they were meeting someone who needed them, someone who had something to offer, someone who might have been a friend if things had gone differently. That is why the impact was so devastating. They trusted, and their trust was devoured. The houses where these events took place still stand. They are not burned. They are not abandoned. They blend into the neighborhoods around them, painted over, sold, lived in again by families who do not always know what happened before them. Yet the walls remember. The floorboards remember. The silence inside those houses is thicker than silence should ever be. This is the weight of context, to understand that the horror did not arrive like a storm. It grew quietly, like mold under wallpaper, unseen until it spread too far. It was there in the first message typed, in the first phone call made, in the first step taken toward a stranger's door. No one in those neighborhoods expected history to stain their street. Yet it did. Every missing poster taped to a telephone pole, every news van parked at the curb, every whispered conversation between neighbors who lowered their voices when they passed by the house. The community learned something it could not unlearn. The predators had not come from somewhere else. They had always been among them, and the question lingered long after the crime scene was cleared. How many times had others walked away safely, never knowing how close they had come to disaster? How many survivors carried stories they never told, stories that ended with unease instead of violence? The truth is that the visible cases were only a fraction. The others remained shadows, unnamed, unrecorded, but no less real. The narrator's voice hardens. The context is not only about where it happened, it is about why it keeps happening. Strangers trust strangers. They tell themselves it will be fine. They tell themselves they are careful. But care is not enough. What waits inside those houses is not stopped by caution. It waits because caution itself is what draws you closer. You think you are in control. You think you are prepared. But the moment you step forward, the story is no longer yours. And so the stage is set. A time when online trust blurred with physical danger. A place where ordinary streets hid extraordinary violence. People who only wanted something small, something harmless. And behind it all, an unseen figure watching, waiting for the doorbell to ring. The context is the soil. In it, fear grows quietly, patiently, until it blooms into something that cannot be ignored. The story always begins with something simple. A message exchanged. A place agreed upon. The words were plain, stripped of anything sinister. But in their simplicity lay the first step toward something no one could reverse. A woman had been looking for a couch. She had just moved into a smaller apartment after a separation, and money was thin. Buying new furniture was not possible. So she turned to the listings online, scrolling through photographs of items strangers wanted to discard. She saw one that seemed perfect. Dark fabric, hardly worn, free if she could pick it up that night. It was the kind of listing that seemed like a stroke of luck. Too perfect to question, too tempting to ignore. The emails came quickly after. A voice behind the words introduced itself without giving anything away. No last name. No explanation. Only an address written without punctuation, as if typed too fast. It was on the edge of town, not far from a stretch of woods that swallowed the roads when the sun went down. She thought about hesitating, but need is stronger than hesitation. She convinced herself it would be safe. She told herself that people give away things all the time, that there was nothing strange about generosity. Yet even in those early moments, something whispered unease into her mind. The address came with instructions. Come after dark. Easier for me. The word should have been enough to stop her, but need dulls instincts. She read them again, shrugged, and told herself it was nothing. People worked strange hours. Maybe this person only returned home late. Maybe they had their own reasons. The excuses built a shield, thin but convincing enough to make her step forward. The drive that night was long. The streetlights thinned and the neighborhoods became sparse. The houses leaned farther from one another, their windows black and blind. The road narrowed, and the trees pressed closer. Each turn she made seemed to lead her deeper into silence. The sound of her own tires on cracked asphalt echoed louder than it should have. Her phone lost signal half an hour before she reached the address. She held it in her lap, watching the empty bars, her thumb brushing the screen as if her touch alone could force it back to life. She told herself it was fine. People lived here. Families lived here. This was still civilization, even if it did not feel that way. She reached the house at last. It looked ordinary at first glance. One story, white shutters, a porch light that buzzed faintly against the darkness. But something about it was wrong. The yard was too neat, trimmed almost aggressively. The windows were too clean, as if they had been wiped again and again until no trace of fingerprints remained. And the porch light, though bright, lit nothing. It did not reveal the face behind the door. She parked the car and sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than she realized. Her breath fogged the windshield. The air was heavier here, as if the silence itself pressed closer. She stepped out. The gravel crunched underfoot, a sound too loud, too final. She walked to the porch. She knocked on the door. The echo of it spread into the house, then died. No answer. She waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. She knocked again, softer this time, as if afraid of being heard. The door opened, only a sliver, a face hidden in shadow. The porch light flickered once. "You're here for the couch," the voice asked. It was flat, toneless, as if rehearsed. She nodded. "Come in. It is in the back." The words felt practiced, like lines repeated too often, but she stepped forward. The threshold yawned open. The air inside smelled faintly of something burnt, something metallic. She tried not to notice. The living room was empty. No couch in sight. The floorboards groaned under her feet as she moved deeper inside. The shadows stretched farther than they should have, as if the house was larger inside than it appeared outside. Her phone in her pocket buzzed once. She pulled it out. No signal. Only a black screen, then static, then nothing. She swallowed. Her throat was dry. "Where is it?" she asked. "In the back," the voice repeated. The hallway was long, too long for a house this small. A single door at the end stood closed. Light seeped out from underneath, flickering. She felt the weight of every step. The floor creaked louder. Her pulse echoed in her ears. Each breath she took sounded foreign, unnatural, as if the house itself was listening. She reached the door. She reached for the handle. She hesitated. Behind her, the front door closed with a slow, deliberate click. And in that moment she understood. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but it was already too late. The investigation did not begin with clarity. It began with fragments. A missing persons report filed late, when family and friends realized too much time had passed without a word. The police marked down the details. Last seen driving toward an unfamiliar part of town. Last contact made through a classified ad. They wrote the words without emotion, but already the pattern felt familiar. The house was searched. At first glance, it was empty. The furniture inside seemed carefully staged, as if no one had lived there for months. Dust lay on surfaces in thin, untouched layers. Yet there were signs that someone had been there. A half-burned candle still carried the scent of wax. A mug on the counter contained coffee that had long gone cold. And in the corner of the living room, something darker. A couch cushion torn open, the stuffing ripped out as if someone had searched for something or hidden something inside. Neighbors were questioned. They remembered cars pulling up late at night, people stepping out, knocking on the door, and sometimes never returning to their vehicles. Some neighbors swore they had heard voices through the thin walls, low, sharp whispers that always seemed to cut off too quickly when anyone listened too closely. Others said they saw shadows moving behind curtains, but no lights inside, no silhouettes that made sense. A notebook was found in a drawer. It contained a list of dates, addresses, and single words written in sharp block letters. Lamp, ride, books, room. The handwriting was consistent, careful, and deliberate. Each item appeared next to a phone number, but the numbers no longer worked. When investigators dialed, they met silence, disconnected tones, or in one case, a stranger who claimed never to have seen the number before. The phone records traced back to disposable devices purchased with cash at corner stores. No names, no trails, just the echo of someone who understood how to disappear. The experts called it a hunting ground. Craigslist, they said, was not dangerous by design, but it created the perfect cover for those who sought control over others. The anonymity gave predators everything they needed: bait, distance, and an endless supply of potential victims. One expert described it as a stage without a curtain. You place the prop, he said, and they come to you. They come willingly. They walk into the scene without realizing what role they are playing. Reports conflicted. Some claimed the house had been rented under different names over the years, each occupant staying only a few months before leaving without notice. Others said the house had never been properly rented at all, that it sat abandoned, owned on paper by shell companies, passed from one to another like a secret no one wanted to keep. Inside, the walls told their own story. Scratches along the baseboards, faint but deliberate, as though something sharp had dragged across them. A closet door with a lock on the outside rather than the inside. Stains in the carpet that had been scrubbed until the fibers thinned, but the color remained. What haunted the investigators most were the contradictions. Witnesses swore they had seen the missing woman leave the house. One neighbor claimed she watched her step into her car and drive away. Yet the car was still parked in the driveway the next morning, unlocked with the keys still inside. Another neighbor said he heard her voice that night, muffled and panicked, calling out a word he could not understand. But when asked to repeat it, his memory faltered. He said it might have been help, but he could not be certain. Confusion became its own evidence. Stories overlapped without a lining, leaving gaps that swallowed the truth whole. Each detail seemed sharp in isolation, but when placed together they formed a picture that dissolved under scrutiny. The experts spoke again. They said memory bends when it touches fear. They said trauma reshapes recollection, creating phantoms where certainty should be, but others believe something deeper. They whispered that the contradictions were not flaws in memory but the mark of design. Whoever orchestrated this encounter wanted the evidence to fracture, wanted the story to remain unsolved. The facts alone were enough to unsettle, but it was the emotional aftermath that carried the deepest scars. For the families, the silence was heavier than any answer could have been. They sat in rooms that still held the scent of the missing, clothes folded in drawers, photographs fixed on walls. Every object became a reminder. A half-used shampoo bottle in the shower, a book left open on the nightstand, shoes at the door waiting for feet that would never return. The absence screamed louder than the truth. In the first weeks, grief carried hope. Families told themselves there was still a chance, that perhaps the victim had simply lost their phone. that they might still come home. But hope is fragile. Each day that passed chipped away at it until it became denial, until denial collapsed into despair. Some prayed for answers. Others prayed only for the silence to end, even if the truth was unbearable. The community bore its own wounds. Neighbors who once felt safe walking at night now locked their doors with trembling hands. They glanced at strangers longer than before, searching for hints of malice in ordinary faces. Conversations shifted. People whispered about what had happened, but never too loudly, never for too long. Fear had made them cautious. Fear had made them complicit in their silence. Those who had spoken to the missing before their disappearance were haunted most. A coworker who had seen her leave that day. A friend who had read her last message. The neighbor who thought he heard her voice behind the walls of the house but convinced himself it was something else. They replayed those moments endlessly, punishing themselves with what-ifs. What if they had stopped her? What if they had gone with her? What if they had called sooner? The questions had no answers, but they refused to stop asking. For those who had visited similar houses through the same site, paranoia became a constant shadow. They remembered the awkward smiles of strangers, the odd smells in unfamiliar rooms, the doors that creaked too slowly when opened. They wondered why they had survived. Was it luck? Was it timing? Or had someone chosen not to act, waiting for a better opportunity? Survival became guilt. Guilt that festered until every memory felt poisoned. Psychologists spoke of trauma, of how communities unravel when trust collapses. They explained how fear embeds itself in small rituals. People no longer met in strangers' homes. They met in crowded parking lots in daylight with others watching. Some never returned to the site at all, unwilling to risk even the smallest chance. Yet the fear never fully left. It sat behind every choice, an invisible hand steering them away from risk, even when risk was unavoidable. For survivors who came close but managed to walk away, the damage was different. They described feeling eyes on them long after leaving the house. They described dreams where hallways stretched forever, where locked doors rattled in the dark. Some refused to sleep with the lights off, convinced the silence of their own homes could not be trusted. Others tore down their curtains, unable to stand the thought of glass separating them from the night outside. One survivor admitted he still drove by the house months later. He would stop his car at the corner, headlights off, staring at the windows. Sometimes the curtains shifted. Sometimes the porch light flickered. He told himself it was the wind, but he never rolled down his window, never stayed long enough to know. He wanted answers, but answers meant stepping closer. And he had already learned what happened when you stepped closer. The trauma spread outward. Children overheard parents whispering about disappearances and grew afraid of sleeping alone. Stores in the area lost business as locals chose not to venture out at night. Even years later, new residents spoke of a tension they could not explain, a weight in the air that clung to the streets after dark. The police who handled the case did not leave unscathed either. Officers who entered the house described a pressure in their chest, a sense that the air itself resisted them. One admitted privately that he still dreamed of the hallway with the locked door at the end, even though he had opened it and found nothing inside. Another said the silence of the house followed him home, filling his bedroom at night until he began sleeping in his living room, too afraid to close his eyes where the silence was deepest. The narrator's voice lowers, steady but sharp. Fear does not end when the crime is over. Fear becomes its own crime, repeating endlessly inside those who survive. It rewrites memory. It corrodes trust. It makes strangers of neighbors and strangers of the self. What was once ordinary becomes unbearable. A knock on the door. A light left on. A phone that rings too late at night. In the end, the psychological impact was not measured in arrests or reports. It was measured in the way people changed. The way they carried themselves differently, spoke differently, looked at each other differently. They no longer lived in the same world they had before. The world had shifted. The ground beneath them was no longer stable, and, the most disturbing truth of all, was that the person responsible might still be out there, watching, waiting, ready to post another listing. The families never stopped grieving. The survivors never stopped looking over their shoulders. And the community never stopped wondering when the next knock on a stranger's door would be the last. The official investigation unfolded slowly, tangled in fragments of evidence that seemed to repel resolution. Detectives combed the house, reviewed records, questioned neighbors, and yet the story resisted closure. The deeper they searched, the more the truth seemed to blur, as if someone had designed the events to remain unsolved. The first theory leaned toward the simplest explanation: a predator using Craigslist as a hunting ground. The pattern fit. The listing offered something tempting and free. The location was isolated. The communication was vague, offering just enough to lure someone but never enough to be traced. Authorities explained that predators thrive where trust is blind. A stranger offering a sofa or a ride has all the power once the victim arrives, because the victim has already convinced themselves that nothing is wrong. But even within this explanation, there were gaps. If this was the work of a single predator, why had the neighbors' testimonies contradicted one another so violently? How could some swear they saw the woman leave, while her car remained in the driveway untouched? Why did the house seem staged, stripped of anything personal, as if no one had truly lived there? The predator theory explained motive, but not the inconsistencies. The second theory was stranger. Some believed the house itself was a trap, not just the person behind the door. The ownership records were too confusing, bouncing between companies that did not exist, names that dissolved into nothing. Investigators who pressed deeper into these records found dead ends at every turn. This suggested organization, a system larger than one person. Perhaps the house was part of something broader, an organized ring, a network of criminals who used anonymity as their shield. Those who believed this theory pointed to the notebook with its careful lists of dates, words, and phone numbers. They argued it looked less like the scribbles of one disturbed mind and more like inventory. Victims treated as transactions. Each word, lamp, ride, room, stood not for an object but for a lure. Each date marked the time someone had walked into the house. If this was true, then the woman who disappeared was not an accident. She was one of many. The third theory reached even further into unease. It suggested that what had happened could not be explained by human intent alone. The contradictions in testimony, the impossibility of details, the lingering presence felt by those who entered the house afterward, these things did not behave like ordinary crimes. Witnesses reported losing time inside the house. Watches stopped working. Phones drained their batteries completely within minutes. A policeman described walking through the hallway and feeling as if he had stepped into a space larger than the building itself. Paranormal investigators were dismissed officially, but privately, some detectives admitted the evidence felt wrong in ways they could not name. The locked door at the end of the hall was empty when opened, yet multiple visitors had described hearing movement behind it. The photograph that showed a distorted figure in the window refused to be dismissed, even though experts could not explain the blur. Theories emerged that the house itself had absorbed something malignant, that the disappearances were not just crimes but rituals of repetition, pulling strangers into a loop that had no exit. Conflicting theories left the case unsettled. The families clung to the idea of a predator because it at least offered a human face to blame. Law enforcement leaned toward the organized ring theory because it provided structure, a system that could be hunted down, even if it had not been caught. And others whispered the third theory in private, never daring to speak too loudly, but never able to shake the sense that something beyond human design had taken place. The public, meanwhile, spun their own conspiracies. Some claimed to have escaped similar houses, others posted warnings online, urging strangers never to meet sellers in private spaces, never to follow vague directions, never to trust anyone without proof. A few claimed the house was still active, that new listings continued to appear under new usernames, always offering something free, always waiting in the same general area. Whether those posts were true or only fueled by fear, no one could say. The narrator's voice turns quiet here, heavy with weight. Theories are not answers. They are attempts to hold on to meaning when the truth slips away. They give shape to the void, but they do not fill it. A predator, a network, something not of this world. Which one is real? Perhaps all. Perhaps none. The only certainty is the silence left behind. The case remained open. Files sat in drawers. Photographs paperclipped to reports. Notes scribbled in margins that led nowhere. Every few years someone reopened the folder, studied the evidence again, and reached the same conclusion. There was no conclusion. And through it all, the house stood, its porch light flickering, its windows blind, its silence waiting. What happened inside it may never be explained. Theories gave the community something to cling to, but none could erase the unanswered question. What was waiting behind that door? And why did it choose some and not others? The story does not end with an arrest. It does not end with a confession. It ends with silence, and that silence is heavier than any verdict could ever be. The woman who left her home that night to collect a couch never returned. Her car remained where she had parked it, her belongings untouched, her family left with questions that deepened rather than diminished with time. The house was searched, emptied, and eventually sold again. New families moved in, curtains were drawn, lawns were mowed, but the weight of what had happened inside those walls lingered like a shadow no light could erase. To this day, the case is remembered not for resolution, but for its absence. Theories filled the void, but none delivered peace. Was it a predator hiding behind a false listing, waiting for the right victim? Was it a network treating human lives like currency, transactions logged in notebooks and phone calls? Or was it something darker, something that twisted the rules of reality itself, leaving contradictions behind like fingerprints on glass? The answers never came, and perhaps they never will. That is what makes the story endure. Fear thrives not on what is known, but on what is left unsaid. The silence inside that house spoke louder than any evidence. The contradictions in testimony spread unease like infection. And the image of the door, the one that opened to a sliver of shadow and then closed again, remains burned into the imagination of everyone who has heard the story. The tragedy is not only in what happened, but in how ordinary it began. A simple listing online, a promise of something free, a stranger's voice offering directions. These were not warnings, not at first. They were familiar. They were mundane. And that is why the story still terrifies. It reminds us that danger does not announce itself. It hides in the most ordinary places, waiting for trust to crack open the door. The families who lost someone never stopped grieving. They learned to live with the absence, but the absence never softened. Some kept rooms untouched, waiting for a return they knew would never come. Others tried to move forward, but every knock at the door, every call from an unfamiliar number sent them spiraling back into the night their loved one vanished. They lived not with closure, but with a wound that refused to heal. The community never fully recovered either. The streets grew quieter. Neighbors who once waved stopped making eye contact. Suspicion replaced routine trust. People who had once posted ads online stopped doing so, or demanded to meet only in crowded parking lots under the glare of security cameras. The marketplace that had once promised convenience now whispered of risk, and the house itself, ordinary in design, indistinguishable from 1,000 others, remains a scar. Families have lived there since, but each one tells the same story. Doors that creak without reason, hallways that seem longer at night than during the day, a weight in the silence pressing against the chest as if the house itself remembers more than it should. Some moved away quickly, unable to stand the atmosphere. Others stayed, but spoke little, as though putting the experience into words would give it power. The narrator's voice lowers almost to a whisper. You think you can avoid it. You think it will not happen to you. You tell yourself you are careful. You tell yourself you are different. But the truth is simpler. The truth is this: the door opens for anyone. Even now, new listings appear. A chair, a desk, a ride to the city. Always ordinary, always harmless on the surface. But hidden within is the possibility that you are answering more than an ad. Perhaps you are stepping into a story already written. Perhaps you are becoming a detail in a notebook, a voice someone remembers hearing but cannot describe later. The cliffhanger lies not in what happened before, but in what may happen next. Because stories like this one never truly end. They echo, they repeat, and they wait for someone new to knock. The camera lingers on an image of a door in the dark, a faint glow of light spilling through the crack at the bottom. A shadow moves across it, slow and deliberate. The sound of breathing fills the silence. Then the voice speaks one last time, steady, unyielding. Would you open it, or would you walk away? The question matters less than you think, because sometimes the choice is not yours to make. The screen fades to black. The silence remains. The unease does not leave, and somewhere a new listing has already been posted.